Marty?
Hello.
You need to be
Hi.
in front of the camera.
Yes. All right, let me take off my sun protection.
Hey,
Hopefully I won't. I might put my sunglasses back on depending on how much glare it feels like there
You
is.
can see something in the field and you know you're on camera.
All right, so I'll stand as close as I
Loud
can.
and fast. So stop it out.
All right, come on as close together as you feel comfortable. Just because, you know, I'll be talking for hopefully 30 minutes.
Excuse me? You're kidding, right?
No.
No.
30 minutes?
No, yeah, this is usually between 8 and 12 minutes.
Oh,
Well,
okay.
Whatever.
Talk fast.
But you
you have a lot
can
to say. Yeah.
yeah, I think
I'll skip some sections, but I'll have to figure out how to do so
Okay.
on the fly, I think. So we'll see.
Go for it.
So,
yeah, we give you I
yeah,
give you
and
permission.
also, if anyone needs to leave, I will not take offense. My name is Mardi. I am Mardi Fuller. I live in Boston, and I love Martha's Vineyard. I've been coming out here since 1998 when a friend invited me. That friend is on her way here. She'll be here momentarily. And I spent a summer after college actually working at the Chilmark Community Center and hostessing at Lola's, if you remember that restaurant.
Yeah.
This was back in 2001. I have that Chilmark Road Race shirt. I did that.
Did you beat me?
Maybe, but unclear, not sure. So this place feels like home to me, near and dear to my heart, even though I'm, come for a week or two most summers. I've had the pleasure of spending a few longer summers out here. Worked at a camp in West Tisbury for a couple years after college. So I love being here. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Appreciate you inviting me. Thank you to Kelly for inviting me to speak and hosting me in her beautiful home. And Kelly invited me because I write and speak about being a Black outdoors woman. We know each other because we both hike and recreate in Wabanadnock, which is the land of the Abenaki, Wabanaki, and Pequawket people, otherwise known as the White Mountains of New Hampshire. Has anyone here hiked or spent time in the White Mountains? Just curious. Excellent. I hike, I bike, I backpack, I climb, I ski, I paddle on that land and have been doing so for about 20 years. And around the time of George Floyd's murder, I actually started speaking about my experiences as a Black person in these landscapes because they are extremely white, oppressively white, and Black people have a term we say PWI, which means primarily white institution, which could mean a school or a college or any institution. I use that term to refer to outdoor culture, the institution of outdoor culture and the industries around it. So being Black in a PWI, in this case outdoor spaces, is something that I have been writing about for the last couple years and has become somewhat of a side vocation in addition to my full-time job as a communications person as a nonprofit. And in this capacity of kind of doing commentary and writing and speaking, I also volunteer and lead trips for a group called Outdoor Afro, which is a national organization that centers Black experiences and connection in the outdoors and also in conservation. And I'm just deeply invested in access to natural spaces for Black folks and others who've been marginalized, for other BIPOC, queer people, people with disabilities. And I want racialized and marginalized folks in particular to understand how white supremacy has intermediated our relationship to nature, and I want white people to examine that, engage in reparations, get out of the way, and support when asked. So I'm just going to share a little bit about my work and hope that you can find some takeaways that you can apply to your work together as Martha's Vineyard, Black Lives Matter, and to the ways that you engage in anti-racism. And I was thinking, what are the ways that my work is most relevant to you all? And for obvious reasons, beach access came to mind. And access and equity in having opportunities for water safety and swimming instruction. So Black and non-white folks have faced exclusion, often violent, from swimming pools and public beaches for the entirety of this country's history. In the early 20th century, municipal pools were built in countless white neighborhoods, but not in the Black parts of town. And in the 20s and the 30s, there was like this sudden pool building spree. There was a trend. And at the same time that this trend was happening, there was a movement to integrate pools along gender lines for the first time. So men and women were allowed to swim together, people of all genders, for the first time in history. And this integration of genders also invoked these super racist fears on the part of white people that Black men would prey on white women. You think, about the movie Birth of a Nation that came out, just a few years prior, I think 1915 or 17. And then a fear that Black people would bring disease to pools. So the timing also dovetailed with Jim Crow in the South and official and de facto segregation in the North and Midwest and West. And so, this was all happening, impeding access for Black folks to swimming spaces. And then when pools began to desegregate in the 60s by law, many white families fled to private pools and cities spent less on public pools, and that's a pattern that persists today. So naturally, reduced access to pools and beaches led to diminished water safety ability in the Black community. There are countless stories of Black people being run off of public beaches, even as late as August of '75. A large group of Black protesters showed up in Boston, Carson Beach, right in Saudi, to just have a peaceful protest and declare that they had a right to be there and use the beach. And a white riot erupted that devolved into violence. And of course, it's a civil right infringement to deny access to public beaches. And it's just one of the many ways that Black people have been banned, policed. Our movement has been limited and monitored. And lack of access to beaches cuts us off from physical and mental health opportunities, the benefits of connecting with nature, and really most acutely, it's the main reason for the disparity, the gross disparity in drowning rates between Black and white people. So the latest CDC data on drowning rates came out in 2021. Native people drowned at twice the rate of white people, and Black people drown at 1.5 times the rate of white people. More Black people happen to drown in pools, and more Native people happen to drown in open water. I think that's just because of where Native folks, where reservations are and where there's more concentration of people, and more Black people have been urbanized. And really disturbing to me is the fact that disparities in drowning rates between Black and white people actually increased from 2005 to 2019. And the CDC doesn't know why. There's research going on now, but they do not know why there's been an increase over the last 14, well now at this point 16 years. 67% of Black children had little or no swimming ability, compared to 36% of white children. And Black youth between the ages of 10 and 14 drown in swimming pools at 7.6 times the rate of white youth in the same age range. This is really stark, and you can draw a straight line between these statistics and lack of access to pools and to beaches, lakes, rivers, not just ocean beaches, any public swimming area. So I don't have any solutions to this, but I do want to throw this out there because it's kind of a massive elephant in the room in a place like Chilmark. So if you've got access to private beaches and town beaches which are essentially private, I just challenge you to think about your relationship, the relationship between your exclusive beach access, which is perhaps generational, to the fact that Black people have been excluded from beaches for generations, and thereby excluded from swimming and water safety skills. Do Black Lives Matter enough to give up some beach privilege and some of your beach access? And just, if Black Lives Matter, it has to mean not just keeping us alive, that's the first thing, it's very important, but also means access to the opportunities and resources that white people have allotted themselves for centuries. And so, also additionally, as a community that cares about equity, how do you reconcile your exclusive beach access? And by access, I also mean maybe it's private, maybe it's town. All of us with the ability to be here in Martha's Vineyard, we have some elevated amount of access to wonderful beaches, right? So how do you reconcile that access with the fact that most people in the state of Massachusetts literally have to do mental and physical gymnastics to figure out how to have a nice beach day on an uncrowded beach and get a parking spot? Only 12% of Massachusetts coastline is open to the public, and we're a state of 6.8 million people. And some of that, it's like the nature of our coastline, the ruggedness. But as many of you probably know, a Massachusetts law dating back to the colonial ordinances of 1641 to 47 grants property access, property owners' boundaries to the low tide line as opposed to the high tide line. I'm sure that gets talked about a lot here.
Mm-hmm.
And we are one of only 4 states. The only other states that limit access to the low tide line are Maine, Delaware, and Virginia. Every other state in the country, beaches are either public, like if you can get onto the beach and you can be there, or private property goes to the high tide mark, so you can at least walk along the beach when the tide is up. So, I had a friend who recently moved to Boston who asked me where she could go to have a nice stay on a quality beach. And I've lived here for 20 years, so I know lots of secrets. And so I spent about 30 minutes explaining to her a gauntlet of, how she could navigate a gauntlet essentially to end up on a beach. So, you can enter the trustees of the reservation lottery. You can take the commuter rail to Manchester by the Sea that runs at certain times. You can get there super early and get a spot. You can kayak to some access points that cars can't get to. There are tons of motorboats, but you can kayak there and end up on Crane Beach or in New Hampshire in Narragansett or in Charlestown, Rhode Island. Excuse me, New Hampshire. I meant Rhode Island, Narragansett. So it's just so dang hard to get to the beach. What's the implication there? So just ask you to think about it. I don't have solutions. I also am happy to be on a private beach when I get access to it, because it's wonderful, right, to not be crowded and to have that experience. But there's corollary, and who knows what my shirt is about.
Places where there is access.
Yeah, well, these are actually historically Black beaches. So the Inkwell, you're familiar with. Idlewild in Michigan. Sag Harbor is in New York on Long Island. And American Beach is Jacksonville, Florida. These are each beaches where Black people in the 40s and 50s who had some access to economic mobility and had some money, bought beach land so that Black people could have a place to go to the beach and not be kicked off, not be threatened by violence, and be able to swim. So it's important. It's important for water safety, and it's important for just health and well-being and just having a good life. So I just challenge you to think about that. So just to move on to sharing a bit about my general work in the outdoor community. Black folks and BIPOC have been historically excluded from outdoor spaces, and it's been hard for white mainstream folks in outdoor circles to see and acknowledge the ways that we have been excluded, because they don't know the nation's history, because our schools don't teach on its history, and they don't know how we've gotten to where we are. and haven't examined how our nation's ideological foundations around nature have laid groundwork for discrimination. They're unaware of many of the hidden and enduring mechanisms of racial exclusion. Some of these mechanisms are silent, subtle, and small, but compounded, they have great impact. So just to give you some background on this, so you have some context for me telling you some of my stories. American ideas of nature and the concept of nature and the quote-unquote natural world, as well as ideas of preservation and conservation, were shaped alongside the original United States nation-building project, which was predicated on the genocide of indigenous nations, the enslavement of Black people, and the creation of a brand new identity for this land that we now call the United States. And just like Black and Indigenous, Asian, Latinx, multiracial people were not included in the narrative of who constitutes the citizenry of the U.S., we weren't included when the same white men created narratives around our natural spaces and who they're for. The current mainstream construct of nature that we still operate out of is an American myth. This myth was developed into a rich ideology that uses as descriptors language like wild, untamed, empty, untouched, pristine. This language was purposefully constructed in the 1800s when the West was being violently seized from Native people. The myth declared that the new land was ready to be filled with white storytelling and white bodies. Even the often repeated phrase wild spaces, wide open spaces. Think about that. Like, it comes out of this idea of open wilderness that's available to you. But we know that Native people built roads and systems of agriculture. They did controlled burns. They created infrastructures that were, fully operational when settler colonists forcibly removed them from the land. The land was not empty and wide open. Our roads and our trails today even follow ancient roots, even though we've attempted to erase their origins. So, I hiked in Alaska, the Chilmark Trail, which runs from Dyea, Alaska to Bennett, British Columbia, and it's an ancient Tlingit trade route that was co-opted by the Klondike Gold Rush. And now it's called the Klondike Gold Rush National Historic Park. But it's a trade route that's been around for hundreds of years. And a key architect of this mythology of nature was Teddy Roosevelt, who was enamored with the idea and the construction of the cowboy. And he spoke plainly of the genocide of Native people. Like, he said things about Native people that I wouldn't even feel comfortable repeating. He's known for founding the national park system and for opening land expressly for white people to expand into. So Yosemite National Park, which was the first national park in the country, was established only after the federal government removed the Miwok Nation violently from the valley, from the Yosemite Valley. And amazingly, as a side note, this removal was echoed a little over 100 years later in 1969 when the Park Service cleared out a village that had been grandfathered in of Miwok people and removed 15 families who had even been serving as park employees. So when Gifford Pinchot and John Muir, on behalf of the federal government, were developing and operationalizing their conservation and preservation strategies that would allow white people to freely occupy the land, at the same time, the federal government was putting laws into place to limit movement across the land and accessibility for Black people, for Chinese people who were here as workers in that time, and for Native people. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Homestead Act of 1862, which gave 160 acres of free land to white men, even at the same time that the movement to give former slaves 40 acres and a mule was rescinded by the government under Andrew Johnson to appease former Southern slaveholders after the Civil War. So when we're able to examine and deconstruct white environmental ideology, we're better able to see the way we've been trained to think of nature, that the way we've been trained to think of nature is a concept that we inherited from the nation's founders. Our world exists outside of our attempt to characterize it in Abenaki, the language of folks in New Hampshire, Vermont, and some of Maine, there's no word for nature because nature is everything. It's our world. It's us. We are nature. We're part of nature. And in the same way, race is a concept. Race was invented, and it was really invented around the same time as this wilderness ideology was. And the two kind of were shaped in conjunction with each other over the course of the founding of the country. I am still working through the layered implications of the fact that the Civil Rights Act and the Wilderness Act were signed into law within 2 months of each other by Lyndon Johnson. That'll be another talk. Another key part of this development of the concept of nature was how Europeans, like in Europe, and white Americans used science, law, art to establish a grossly pseudo-scientific natural hierarchy with white people as fully human up here and somehow above or separate from nature with a mandate to dominate it, tame it, subjugate it, extract its resources, which of course is at the root of capitalism and environmental degradation, right? But this ideology also positioned black people at the bottom of this natural hierarchy. And really anyone who wasn't white was along this line and considered subhuman and a part of nature as opposed to white people who were above nature. You may have heard of Ota Benga, a man who was abducted from the Congo in the 20s and put in the Bronx Zoo and called the missing link between apes and men meant white men. Shockingly horrific act, and actually served as a really cultural significant visual in spreading this idea of black people being subhuman. So I give you that background just to say, these are the foundations of white environmental ideology that a lot of folks don't know much about, and I've just given you like a cursory overview, and I can tell you which scholars to go to read more about this. So that's like the very beginning of why black folks and non-white people have limited access to nature, because it starts in the ideology. It starts like with ideas, which are very powerful, right, and become our practices. In addition to these foundations, there are plenty of factors at play in understanding how white supremacy in outdoor institutions impacts black participation rates. So I'm just gonna rattle through them. So black folks' complicated relationship to the natural world and the land due to being forced to work the land during the eras of slavery and sharecropping, Jim Crow and de facto segregation in which we were banned from parks, white terrorism and targeting which could unfold in the woods. You could be raped, you could be murdered, you could be lynched, or maybe even just falsely accused. You could come across hostile landowners. To this day, like my current white friends, often if we're hiking or maybe we're like in a beach area like this, they will view no trespassing signs very casually and say, oh, like we can cut through here, we can walk through here. And I'm like, hell no, like I don't know who's on the other side of that sign. Like I don't know how they will react when they see me. Just a side note, don't expect your black friends to trespass. Listing through the reasons, continuing, the systematic ghettoization of our cities over the course of the 20th century, which was perpetrated at every level of society. You know, redlining was federal, at the state level, municipal level, real estate market, and players in the real estate market. The community level, neighborhood associations and churches participated in this as well, pushing black folks into concentrated urban areas that were starved of resources, including green spaces, small city parks. Running while black, birding while black, over-policing, discrimination from law enforcement that happens, you know, the law enforcement agencies, park rangers or whatnot in natural spaces. Additionally, stories of black and BIPOC nature heroes have either been erased or ignored. The historical canon of nature writing that we promote is almost exclusively white and male. It's changing now, but think about, you know, what you read as kids. You know, and you've heard of Lewis and Clark, but do you know about York? York was William Clark's slave, who probably did most of the work. I'm exaggerating a bit, but he did a good amount of the work of navigating and, you know, finding their route through the West. And not that I'm glorifying the Western expansion, but why is it that we don't know anything about York? Not celebrating stories of Black heroes and other BIPOC heroes also contributes to low participation rates, because we don't see ourselves represented. And also, the culture around parks and outdoor recreation has been developed entirely by white people, which is a deterrent because it makes it a place that people outside of that culture don't necessarily want to be, whether it's feeling comfortable or actually enjoying being in that space. So, based on what I've shared with you so far, imagine my own internal reaction when a white person comes up to me and asks a question like, well, gosh, why don't more Black people hike? Right? It's like, where to begin? And usually, to not overwhelm myself and think that I've got to spend hours educating them, I flip the question and I ask, well, why do you hike? Why do you hike? And they answer, you know, they might answer like, oh, a family member, a parent, or aunt and uncle, or other adults took me. I hike because I went on school outings or group outings, or I always loved being outside, and that one strikes me as very much lacking in awareness. I just loved being outside. And I asked them that question to point to the fact that they had access that they didn't have to think about. It was part of their culture. They had adults around them who were familiar with the activity, promoted it as an option. They had access to backyards, big and small, parks and wilderness areas. And they also got affirmation in their culture that what they're doing is good and great. And, you know, they got affirmation that they're strong and brave and cool for going hiking and camping, which isn't necessarily the case in Black cultures and other cultures for complicated reasons. And they also aren't recognizing themes and motifs about nature that we hold in our lexicon and we see in branding materials, whether it's a park's website or maybe an interpretive display on preservation land, or a commercial interest like a gear or clothing company. And all of these assumptions and themes are based on how white folks experience nature. So, as an example, like here are some themes I encounter all the time that are implicit. Nature is a peaceful place. Nature is a place for recreation and you have time to recreate. Nature is a place where you can feel comfortable, a place where you can explore wild, open, untrampled backcountry, a place where you're free to operate as you please within whatever the regulations are, without scrutiny. A place where you can create memories and stories all your own, and it's assumed that it's born out of your culture, and that you are following in a tradition that has always been celebrated and with which you are familiar. So these are all just implicit truths that aren't universally applicable to Black people and to other groups. The white folks who ask me why more Black people don't hike don't know all of this background I've just gone through with you, and they view the issue through a lens of the individual choice they made to pick up an activity, instead of analyzing the systems firmly in place that made it possible to do so. My friend and I created a film. Her name is Paula Champagne. She's the videographer, well, the filmmaker and artist. And the film's called Mardi and the Whites. It's been on the film festival circuit since winter. You can watch it online. And it's about my Black identity journey overall, not just in the outdoor world, but the role that hiking and backpacking played in that journey. Because my experience was that although nature offers such regeneration and restoration opportunities, I had access to that, but a lot of the value of that was blocked for me because of the experience of being in a homogeneously white community. and also in a white supremacist country and world. um, so, you know, I've just given you like a cursory overview of structural racism that creates barriers for me and people like me. And over the past 20 years of being an outdoors woman, I've been learning all that history that I just blew through and making sense of it and feeling out the repercussions in my own observations of my community and my own experiences. So all the while that I am hiking and spending time with, you know, almost nearly all white people, I'm experiencing a lot of interpersonal racism, most of it low level. And by low level, I mean that it wasn't too often that anyone said or did something explicit or obvious. But what was constant was that these folks, these white folks, were people who were unconsciously committed to the idea of the invisibility of whiteness. They were white people who never considered their social location within systems of power. They were unaware of how they'd been steeped in racist conditioning in our society, and they were perpetuating racist beliefs and dynamics without any awareness. And I have some stories I could tell you to illustrate that. But like, let's say there's a racial literacy spectrum, and if the spectrum ranges on this side from colorblind, you know, that's one end, and then in the middle you have anti-racist in belief. And maybe at the end you have anti-racist in practice, not just in belief. Most of the folks were somewhere between colorblind and anti-racist in belief. And keep in mind that when you're doing an outdoor activity that's like a high energy, you know, technical activity like I engage in, you're spending a lot of time with people, you're spending sometimes multiple days, and you also really have to trust them because you're teammates, you're climbing together, you're backpacking, you're making decisions together about, you know, what your itinerary is going to look like and how you're all going to stay safe. So it's a pretty intense relationship even if you don't know people that well. And you can't get away once you're engaged in the activity. And so I found that these folks were committed to the invisibility of whiteness, and they were quite eager to have me around, and they were interested in me until I decided to show up as a black person instead of assimilating into their ways of being and their modes of operating. So by show up as a black person, I mean I start to talk about race or politics, or perhaps I'm listening to rap and they don't like rap music, or maybe I'm interacting with them in a way that's direct instead of passive aggressive. All of this was threatening to them. So if I could be black but on their terms, it was fine, but if I took up space, they were deeply uncomfortable. And these folks were really nice. They were loving, like they were fun, they were willing to teach and share their expertise, but they put up a very firm, invisible barrier around understanding race. And, you know, there may have only been a handful of people who kind of put that negative energy out there, but think about how negative behaviors by a subset of people in a group can really color your experience. And also think about the fact that all the other white people were just kind of quietly complicit. So it was kind of like this low level, you know, you could use the word microaggression, low level psychological terror that I was under for years without really acknowledging it to myself. So, you know, and some stories of, there are some ways that this played out that are dynamics rather than examples, but I'll give you a few quick stories of what this experience was like. So someone on this racial literacy spectrum who was more in the colorblind area, a story about a man who lived in a city during grad school. Now we're hiking and he's telling me about his experience living in a city during grad school, and he lived in a black neighborhood, and he found some other word that wasn't black to say that. I can't remember. He was like urban or inner city. I'm like, you can say black. Black, blackity, black, black, black. It's not an insult. It's just who I am. I'm proud of it. So he lived in a black neighborhood, and I think he got mugged. He was targeted, and he was mugged, which was horrible, and I expressed sadness for him that he was mugged, but he kept saying, those people didn't want me there. Those people always targeted me. And I attempted to I asked him to rephrase that. And I said, an individual targeted you. There were some individuals who targeted you. Those people didn't target you. You cannot say that all of the people in the neighborhood who were black didn't like you. That is, I didn't tell him it was an example of a racist way of thinking, but that's, what I'm thinking in my head. But he just refused to acknowledge that that distinction was important. That all black people weren't out to get him, and that was noteworthy to me, that he couldn't do that. He couldn't separate someone's individual action towards him that was, a horrible thing that happened to him from the other people who were also individuals. And this kind of goes back to a way that whiteness operates, in which white people are able to see themselves as individuals, but often see other people as groups and representing their group. The next story is someone further along the spectrum. She was, anti-racist in belief, let's say. I was camping with a group of friends, and I was walking into the campsite late. Everyone knew that this was the case. They were all there. I had something to do. I was getting in late, and I'd agreed to share a tent with a friend, and that when I came to the camp, I would let myself into the tent. I come to the camp. It's late at night. She had just gone to bed, I think. I opened the door to the tent, and she was nodding off. She jumps back and freaks out really quickly, and then she relaxes and starts dying of laughter. And I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry, I scared you. And she yells at the top of her lungs so everyone else in the camp could hear, oh my gosh, I thought you were a bear. Like, okay. And she goes on because she's relieved, and I think she's embarrassed that she thought I was a bear, and then she keeps laughing and laughing and telling the story to everyone, and I was so uncomfortable. And I wasn't actually, the actual fact that she mistook me for a bear is forgivable. But if she knew any of that knowledge that I just explained to you about how, like the old trope that black people are subhuman, and all of the ways in which black people have been called animals, called apes, whatever, gorillas, likened to that. Like if she knew more about that, she wouldn't have escalated the situation. She would have either not told me she thought I was a bear, or she would have not, invited everyone in the camp to hear the story. So that's an example, just of a way that I just made uncomfortable, that if she had a little bit better knowledge, she wouldn't have done that. And then the final story is about a woman who, or about two women who are close friends of mine who are anti-racist in belief but not in practice. I was on a backpacking trip in the Mountain West with 5 other women. One was Asian, 6 other women. One was Asian, 5 were white. And a few of the white women I didn't know well. And I was talking a lot on the trip about being a black woman in the backcountry. And some of my white friends on this trip, the ones I was close with, were bringing up the topic of race. We were talking about race a lot. And this made this one white woman uncomfortable because she didn't have much of a foundation of racial literacy. She didn't know how to participate in the conversation. She didn't understand things we were talking about. And it made her really uncomfortable, and that started coming out through passive aggression towards me. And one day she snapped at me when we were having a discussion, and I pointed out something about how black experience is different from white people's experiences. And I kind of snapped back at her. And she stormed off, and then she entered into a campaign of silence for the remainder of the trip. And I suffered inwardly, and I was really upset about it, but I continued to be part of the group, and I was polite to her. And because of this, because of how she was behaving and how I was behaving, my other white friends were coddling her, trying to make sure she was okay, because they were uncomfortable with dissonance in the group. And so instead of trying to work with her and educate her and get her to see how she could rectify the situation, they were just nervous about the group dynamics, and they thought I was fine. But I was really hurting. And those friends of mine that were coddling the other white woman, and it got to the point too, actually I should share this, that she had stormed off from a campfire one night when we were talking about race again after the initial storming off. And I think she fell asleep on a rock somewhere in the woods. We didn't know where she was. It was dark. we were worried. We wanted to make sure she came back to camp before we went to bed. And so all of us put on headlamps and wandered off independently in the woods looking for her. So here I am, a black woman, wandering off looking for this white woman in the woods. Earlier that day, we had passed 2 separate men with guns on their chests, joking about how they have those guns there for the bears. And I've been mistaken for a bear, right? And I'm walking through the woods. So that's just like this, bad situation that she put me in because she couldn't have a conversation about race. And so, but I tell this story actually to point out the 2 friends who were anti-racist in belief, but not in practice, and to point out that they had not, they were unable to come into that situation, see what was going on, separate me from that woman, make sure I was okay, work with that woman and let her know how she could do better. They were unable to do that. And it took some time and some intervention from a friend for those 2 to be able to understand what they did. And then they ended up growing a lot, and we ended up becoming closer because they were willing to go through some growth in order to rectify or not perpetuate that again, and they apologized to me. So I point that out to say, these are the friends who had read all the books, they'd done trainings, but when a situation got tough, they weren't able to act. So all of these experiences over many years have just led me to be a more boundaried person in who I spend time with, in particular when I'm doing these outdoor activities. And it's also led me to prioritize time with Black people outside, because that affinity space offers us respite from the ways we've been depleted from the effects of racism, large and small. These spaces allow us to be unapologetic in our identities and present to each other and not have to defend our culture, translate our humor or our phraseology. They provide opportunities to learn and practice whatever skills we're working on in the outdoors outside of the white gaze. They invite us to reaffirm and celebrate our worth so that we have the strength to exist and interact with society when we re-enter, the society that devalues us at every level. And that significance of that time together is palpable when we're together, and it's palpable to me when we're apart, because whether we're in these spaces having these experiences or whether we're out with our, with white folks, we know that we have each other for support, and we're kind of bringing knowledge and energy back to the group as a contribution to communal understanding. So, we come together in affinity spaces as people who've been systematically excluded from power and prosperity and weren't considered when white men imagined the environmental ideology that birthed the subsequent parks and programs that we know today. So we together create safe havens, and then we can bring our unique strength and leadership back to the larger group, including white folks. So that's my story. I focus now on using my outdoor leadership to improve access to for Black people and BIPOC by volunteering with the organization I mentioned called Outdoor Afro. I'm involved in New Hampshire in the Mount Washington Valley area with a lot of climbing guide shops and conservation organizations, kind of helping them expand access. I write for Outside Magazine and some other outlets, and I just really try to encourage those who hold power in these spaces to divest of power, decenter themselves, step back, and let Black people, BIPOC, queer, people with disabilities do the leading. And it's been really deeply rewarding to build community and to attempt to dismantle and rebuild new systems in these institutions. So I encourage you to do the same within your spheres of influence and in your work as Martha's Vineyard Black Lives Matter. And thank you for having me.
Thank you.